This is Outlander Science Club, brought to you by Desiree Andrews, midwife, and Karen Daugherty, emergency physician. Claire loves science, and so do we. Come with us as we investigate the science and medicine from the worlds of Outlander.
Hello, everyone. This is Karen, and I am bringing you this week's installment of Outlander Science Club. And this week is all about suturing, and this corresponds to the Voyager read-along chapters 53 to 55. And we discover in the aftermath of this pirate attack that Claire has sustained a pretty significant wound. She has a deep laceration that extends from just about her shoulder to her elbow on her right arm, her dominant arm. And this wound needs to be closed, it needs to be sutured, which gives us two big questions. A, who is going to suture this for her? She's unable to do it because it's on her dominant arm. And B, what are they going to use? What materials do they have available? So let's take a look at who are the potential people that she has that can suture her arm. Of course, there's Jamie, but with his large, rough hands, he's not really known for his fine motor dexterity. We have Fergus, who's always wanting to help Claire, but given his prior trauma and his hand amputation, he's not a great candidate for his job. There are physicians and surgeons who have had similar upper extremity amputations that are able to do these kinds of procedures and practice medicine fully, but they've received lots of training and practice and instruction and have specialized prosthetics to allow them to work this way. We have Marsali. Now, she is probably very skilled with needle and thread, but I'm guessing that sewing human flesh is not something that she would tolerate. So enter Mr. Willoughby. He's already proven himself to be a healer to this group throughout Voyager. And we know he probably does have the fine motor dexterity and skill needed because he has spent his life in China writing poetry and putting it to paper with brushstrokes and beautiful volumes of poetry put to paper. So we have a good candidate for the job. Now, the question is, what are we going to do with this wound? Claire describes the wound. She says, "It was a long, clean-edged slash running at a slight angle across the front of my biceps, from the shoulder to an inch or so above the elbow joint. And while I couldn't actually see the bone of my humerus, it was without a doubt a very deep wound, gaping widely at the edges. It was still bleeding, in spite of the cloth that had been wrapped tightly round it, but the seepage was slow. No major vessel seemed to have been severed." So, fortunately, without having a lot of excessive bleeding, all we really need to do is get this wound properly cleaned and closed with sutures. Now, throughout history, the first sutures used thousands of years ago were made of vegetable material, things like flax or hemp or bark fiber, and later animal sources were used. Hair, pig bristles, and animal skin. And first mentioned around the year AD 150 is catgut sutures. Now, catgut has nothing to do with cats, for our cat lovers out there, but it's suture that's made from the twisted intestines of animals such as sheep, goats, or cattle. It's also the same material that was used in stringed instruments for the strings of violins and also for stringing tennis rackets before synthetic materials were available. The name catgut is thought to perhaps originate from the combination of cattle and gut. So Claire, fortunately, has, of course, in her infinite wisdom, thought ahead, and she has with her catgut suture. And miraculously, after all they've been through so far on this voyage, they still have some left, and it's still available to them. So what do we look for in a suture? Why is catgut or any other substance favorable to use for suturing? At first glance, it seems like sutures would be a pretty simple order. You grab some thread, grab a needle, and you sew up the wound. But it's a bit more complicated when considering materials for sutures, because this material has to be strong enough to hold the tissue together, but also flexible enough to securely knot and have that knot hold. It needs to be hypoallergenic, and ideally you need to be able to sterilize the material. And sutures also can't be made of something like cotton, nothing that can act as a wick that would draw fluids into the wound. And now we have multiple options available to us, and different wounds call for different types of sutures. Two main varieties of sutures are absorbable and non-absorbable. So non-absorbable sutures are the ones that need to be removed at a later date or just remain permanently in the body. And these are most recognizably the black or blue nylon or propylene sutures that you would receive if you cut your finger and got stitches on your finger, or any skin sutures. And these are the ones that remain in place for anywhere from 5 to 14 days, and then they're removed. And other materials like silk or polyester or even stainless steel wire in a surgical setting would be used as a non-absorbable suture. And they also sometimes are used internally, and they would be used in a case when a dissolvable suture would not be ideal, such as when you're repairing a heart or blood vessel and you have something that's continuously rhythmically moving, and these sutures would need to last longer than a dissolvable one would last to give this moving tissue adequate time to heal. And also, interestingly, absorbable sutures dissolve way too quickly in the bladder. The fluids in the bladder dissolve those way sooner than they do in other tissues, so non-absorbable sutures would be beneficial there. And then they're also used to secure various devices, like a chest tube or a central venous catheter. Now, absorbable sutures are made of materials that break down in the tissue after a certain period of time and dissolve, anywhere from a few days to 90 days, depending on the material. And these will be used inside the body, as well as in lacerations of the tongue and in the mouth, places where suture removal is going to be a big problem, even used in children for skin lacerations to avoid the trauma of suture removal later. And these are made of catgut. Catgut still is used today, as well as various synthetic materials. So what about the needle? So today we have sutures that are crimped right into the end of the needle. There's no eye in the needle. It's just one continuous piece. But prior to the 1920s, suturing needles had an eye, just like a sewing needle, and the thread was simply threaded through the eye of the needle like we do with sewing. And this is what Claire would have used. The drawback, of course, being that this eye area is going to be larger than the rest of the needle, and with that two lengths of thread pulled through there, as you pull that through the tissue, it leaves a larger hole and can allow for leakage, and it can be more traumatizing to the wound. But that's likely what Claire had available to her, because those eyeless needles for suturing didn't come into use until the 1920s. So how did Claire manage to obtain needles and suture? So while in Edinburgh, Claire likely had access to all the many shops and artisans of the city, and a local metalworker was probably called upon to create the needles she needed. And this could have been as simple as requesting a simple sewing needle, but asking it to be curved to a particular specification. So she probably went and placed a large order for those, is my best guess. Knowing what she does now about what life in the 18th century is, she would have known that she needed to stop here first on her trips to rebuild her medical supply. As for the catgut suture, I had always imagined Claire making her own sutures as I read these books, making her own sutures from the intestines of sheep that she may have acquired from a local farm or butcher. And the process is rather involved: cleaning, trimming, isolating the useful part of the membrane, soaking it in potassium hydroxide, smoothing it, stretching it, twisting it into strings that are uniform, and sterilizing it. And I have no doubt that Claire would have done this had she needed to, but my guess now is, particularly if she's finding herself in Edinburgh, in this city that she's in, there might have been local musicians and craftsmen that had catgut for stringing violins and other stringed instruments, and my guess is that she was able to purchase it. And I don't know if that's ever clarified in the books later. I don't recall a discussion of her process of making catgut sutures. I'm guessing eventually she probably required making her own because she didn't have cities around. But in Edinburgh, I'm guessing she probably could buy it. So looking at other options, say you did not have any catgut available, you didn't have the resources to make it, what are some other possible ways you could close a wound at that time? So actually throughout history, There have been peoples that use a particular ant to close wounds. The certain species of biting ants have very strong pincer-like mandibles, and they've actually been used as almost like a skin staple to close wounds. The edges of the wound are pulled together, and the head of the ant is allowed to bite across the wound edge, and then the body is twisted off. And by reflex, these jaws just remain tightly clamped across the wound, just like modern day staples. And there are videos you can find online that illustrate this. It's pretty remarkable, and it seems to work pretty well. Staples are used a lot even today, particularly in scalp wounds, and also various skin wounds depending on the characteristics of the wound. So that could definitely be useful. And then another option could be thorns and spines of various plants were used as needles and also as thread. The agave plant in particular is very useful. When the leaf is soaked for a long period of time, it leaves behind long, stringy fibers connected to a sharp tip, essentially a needle and thread once it's dried. Now, of course, this is not going to be sterile, and given that it is vegetable matter, you worry about infection and breaking down, but just a look at some of the possible alternatives there could have been. And also, they could have used silk. A silk thread could have done this job very well too. And I'm guessing had Claire's injury been to her non-dominant arm, she likely would have sewn it herself, one-handed with her good arm, maybe with some assistance from Jamie to tie the knots and cut the ends. And it turns out in doing so, she would have found herself in the company of many physicians in history who have done the same. And there's one famous Russian, Leonid Rogozov, who found himself in Antarctica as the only physician stationed there, developed appendicitis. It was a time of year when he could not be evacuated, and he performed his own appendectomy. And there's a link to that in this week's blog as well. But I'm sure we can all imagine that Claire would have sewn her own arm in a heartbeat, much to the dismay of Jamie and Fergus. But just an interesting look this week at what possibly could have been used for sutures, and it really sheds light on the fact that Claire is always prepared. Got everything she needed in Edinburgh for this trip. We'd love to hear your experiences and your insights on this and Claire's wound and the repair of her wound. You can find us on Twitter at Outlander Sci and also on Facebook at Outlander Science Club. So, until next time, when in doubt, ask yourself, what would Claire do?